I'm Kristen Smith. I'm with the BlockChainge Association. We represent many crypto companies here in Washington before regulators and before Congress. And I can tell you in my job, it is so difficult to have conversations with your everyday member of Congress about our industry and about our issues because they are very complex and challenging. That is why I'm so excited and thrilled to be here today with Congressman Warren Davidson from the 8th District of Ohio, because he is one of our champions. So before we even get started, let's give him a round of applause because he has been absolutely fantastic.
Thanks.
Congressman Davidson had a wonderful start before coming to Congress. He went to school at West Point. He got an MBA from Notre Dame. He owned several manufacturing companies back in Ohio. But then he came here to Washington. He got on the House Financial Services Committee, which is one of the A committees in Congress. And last December, he was the lead co-sponsor of the Bipartisan Token Taxonomy Act, which we'll talk a little bit more about today. But Congressman Davidson, can you give us a sense of how you went from understanding manufacturing and working in that industry to coming here to Congress and leading the charge on the crypto effort?
Yeah, so it's a little non-linear. You know, when I was in the Army, so I started out really enlisted in the Army, got into West Point from being an enlisted soldier, and then thought I would be a career Army officer. So when I was deciding to get out of the Army, and this is pre-9/11, 99, 2000 time frame, I was interviewing with someone and they basically said, I'm like, why would all these businesses want me to work for them? Back then it was Arthur Andersen, now Accenture. I'm like, why are people going to pay me to be a consultant to tell them how to run businesses? You know, how many of your clients need to seize airfields? And they said, you know, well, none, but operations is operations. And when I got into manufacturing, ultimately what I decided to go into, you know, I realized that, yeah, of course you have to apply the context, but, you know, understanding operational dynamics really does transcend industries. And I think the other part is just structured problem solving. And we did a lot of that in manufacturing. Frankly, I'm a bit of a tech nerd personally, so I've read a lot about all this stuff. But, you know, in manufacturing, what we were really doing was taking, you know, old school technology and then applying, you know, the knowledge economy to that. So you have one operator running a machine to where, you know, you have, you know, a room full of machines and a handful of operators, kind of flipping the dynamic there. And then when you look at, integrate that with the military side, you know, kind of the dynamic when I was in Ranger Regiment was to be able to succeed in decentralized operations. And so when you look at what that takes, it takes everyone actually having an agreed upon framework so that you can execute well. So things that are decentralized can actually operate cohesively. Otherwise, you just get chaos. It's like going to listen to the orchestra warm up in the pit. And you know, some people find that pleasing. Most people don't.
Well, that's a very interesting analogy to the decentralized world that many of us operate in. Back in September, you hosted a roundtable discussion at the Library of Congress. I was fortunate enough to be there. I didn't have much to say, but I listened and had lots to learn. And there were about 100 people in the room. It lasted 4 hours. Can you tell us what motivated you to bring this together? Because this really is sort of an unusual thing, I think, for a member of Congress to do outside of the normal committee process. It's, I think, a very bold move, a very smart move. Can you tell us what motivated you to bring folks together, and then what were some of the takeaways from that discussion? Yeah,
thanks. So, you know, as a new member of Congress, even if your party's in the majority, you don't get to schedule your own hearings.
No.
Right? So, you know, when I looked at the problem, though, I mean, you look out there at the market, and as a financial services person, we had a number of hearings, and you know, I couldn't tell you how many times we had hearings that talked on, well, let's explain what blockchain is, or let's explain what Bitcoin is, or let's explain how cryptocurrency works. And unfortunately, I would sit in some of these meetings with members who have literally stated publicly, the only reason anyone would own cryptocurrency is to launder money or evade taxes. And I'm just cringing like, oh, what a horrible view. And I think that it's really just lack of information, people understanding it. And there really are widely publicized instances of fraud and abuse. And when you look at that, when you have some of that, either it really is full of bad actors or you have regulatory uncertainty. And I felt like this was a problem we could solve if we just get everyone at the table. And so I couldn't get the right hearing structured the way that I wanted to. So I just basically talked to folks and said, hey, how about if I just have a round table and just get input? It's voluntary, people can participate or not participate. And as we shared this idea publicly in May of 18 to do something, you know, before fall, you know, so that by the end of the year we could actually do something about the meeting. It started out with a couple companies that were actively coming to the Hill to try to educate people, but you're just Ohio-based companies. Ohio is actually doing great things in blockchain and in you know, the space. And so it started small like that and said, you know, if we can get 20 or so people at the table, maybe we can have some input. And then you started getting C-level executives from some widely known startups, and then people started going, oh, well, this person's coming. Well, maybe we could send our general counsel. And then you started having some of the biggest players in the space, whether, you know, it was Andreessen Horowitz or Consensus, you know, Protocol Labs, and then that started attracting people like Fidelity and State Street, and then that started attracting NASDAQ, and then it was oversold. It was like, okay, we'll take it to 30, we'll take it to 40, we'll take it to 50, and then we had to cap it. We just said if we go any bigger, we won't be able to have meaningful participation. And you know, Ron, who's been great back there in the back, leading the effort for our staff, was literally getting calls to just get input. It's, I have to get into this meeting. She was like, okay, well, we definitely hit the timing with all the confluence of things that were going on at the Securities and Exchange Commission and in the courts in a way where people came together. And I think to cut to the chase, look, the use cases, should I do this or that with cryptocurrency, people debate about. You know, like, oh, I don't like your project. I would never start a company that did this. I'd never start a company that did that. But the framework that's needed, a light touch piece that gives regulatory certainty on what's a security and what isn't a security, was the overwhelming common denominator. And it was striking that there was no one that felt that that should be a partisan issue. I mean, there really are no differences in the desire to have this level of certainty. And, you know, we had people coming from, you know, Silicon Valley, people that ideologically maybe left of Nancy Pelosi, to pure play libertarians, to people that have other goals that are different in the political spectrum. But they said, you know, the common denominator is we got to get some sort of certainty for this.
Yeah, no, that was a similar conclusion I took away, and I was, you know, you spoke about sort of different types of players in the room, and I think it was my second week in my new position at the Blockchain Association. It was the first time many of my members who had long been scheduled to attend your event, and I was worried to death they were all going to get in the same room and it was going to look like some of the battles you see on crypto Twitter or something else. And I think they really, it was very great to see the industry come together in such a constructive way. Let's pivot a second and talk about your legislation, the Token Taxonomy Act that was introduced in December with Darren Soto from Florida. It was described in one article I read as a ray of hope for the industry, which I was very excited when I saw that. And you know, I think it's important because it does provide some of the certainty that you spoke about, and it also would change tax policy to be more favorable for the industry. Can you give us a little bit of sense as to sort of what's next for this legislation? For those of you not familiar with DC, it's a brand new Congress as of January 3rd, so it's sort of a reset button. What do we see for the Token Taxonomy Act here in the 116th Congress? Yeah,
so thanks for the chance to clarify it. And one, you know, just as the earlier session, some of you were probably in other rooms But this session was, what's the best destination for this? And the reality is, the United States has convinced the world for all sorts of things. We are the best destination for goods, services, capital, intellectual property, people. In a way, we are the world's land of opportunity, not because we have anarchy and no regulatory landscape, and not because we have this massive, burdensome, heavy-handed central planner system. And because of that right mix, all these things flourish in the United States in a way that's rare throughout history and, frankly, leads the world in almost every front. And unfortunately, that's not the case right now for blockchain broadly, and certainly for tokens, particularly things that might be viewed as securities. And I think the key here, why we picked the name token taxonomy, is the language is very important. We've been a little sloppy by calling everything a currency. Not everything aspires to be a currency. Not everything that aspires to be a security aspires to be an equity. Essentially, you're looking at your balance sheet saying, hey, I'm getting an asset here, cash, but is that in exchange for equity or is it in exchange for a liability? You could have a distributed liability just like you could have a distributed equity. And some of those shares are voting, some are non-voting. So there will be more work to be done here. And what we wanted to do was look at the most basic common denominator, where everyone had this biggest level of consensus. And the SEC has tried to apply this thing called the Howey test. And essentially, they're trying to talk about oranges and orange groves, and everybody's like, look, I'm doing digital stuff here. I'm not talking about oranges. All right? And at the end of the day, though, the test basically says if you're selling a finished product, the oranges, well, we agree oranges aren't securities. But if you're trying to raise money to buy an orange grove and plant trees and eventually get to a harvest, well, that looks like a security offering. That's been the framework that Howey looks at, is applied to. And, if you're wielding a Howey hammer, everything starts looking like a security. And that was the concern. The SEC started talking about that. And so here we're saying if this meets the criteria in the bill, then it's not a security. It doesn't go beyond that, because that's where you start saying, oh, but we should do it this way, that way. We'll have different bills that address some of those eventually. My hope is we stay light touch. And that's the key, is as we start to drop this, we wanted to get that input from industry and the information out there, just like we've seen broadly covered in the press, most recently in Forbes, at least widely, talking about this bill. So Darren and I dropped it in December to get the input, know that it can't move through committee until the start of the year. And now we're looking to get more co-sponsors to do that in as big of a consensus across party lines as possible. And with as little change to this bill, and saying, well, I have this idea, I have that day. Great, write a different bill. Let's just get this common denominator through and not kill it with amendments or big changes, because that's what happens, is you get 3 or 4 committees of jurisdiction and things can't move. So not only is this good for the industry, it's good for moving it through, because it just moves through financial services. When you start talking about other things, then you run into challenges. And so the key will be that this will be reintroduced. At a minimum, we'll have myself and Darren Soto as co-sponsors, but we're trying to get key constituencies addressed within the Financial Services Committee, so that our new chairman, Maxine Waters, sees this as one of the important early bills for the Financial Services Committee to move. And for some people that don't know her or don't know the industry, they might feel skeptical about that. And I feel optimistic because it's been nonpartisan, as I say. Silicon Valley not generally going to vote on the Republican side, or even on the more moderate wing of the Democratic Party. So that's safe turf over here, but you've got folks in Ohio that have different goals. Across the country, political spectrum, my hope is we can keep the politics out of it, and if we can, I think that this is a bill that could move early this year.
That's wonderful to hear. Obviously with the change of power in the House, I know there have been some folks in the industry that have been saying, are we ready? Do we have a bipartisan path forward? But it sounds like you're saying there definitely is.
And we have interest in the Senate. So we have several senators that are looking at the bill. They weren't doing the lead work on the bill. They're looking to pick it up. We have several senators interested in helping. So we can get there together, and you know, really, in general, the challenge has not been moving things through the House. It's been moving things through the Senate. So if we can get things to move through the Senate faster than the House, that'd be great too. I mean,
doesn't usually happen that way, but
it's rare that it happens that way. But we'll see what the dynamic is right now.
Okay. I have one more question, then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. So you, as we mentioned before, you're obviously very far ahead of most of your colleagues when it comes to understanding this technology and what it can do, and also the issues that we need to address in order for it to reach its full potential. What advice do you have for members of the audience here about what they can do when they're speaking to their own members of Congress about this space?
Well, I think first of all, schedule meetings. So I think a lot of people are, you know, maybe in DC because this is where you're from, you come to the conference, but you're not necessarily interested in politics. Maybe because of the proximity to DC, this group's more interested than your average group of capitalists. But when you're out there, the dynamic is when you get a meeting on a member of Congress's calendar, someone like Ron does staff work, puts all kinds of notes in there, gives a meeting prep brief, and at a minimum, the member of Congress learns a little bit more about the issue. Even if they're somewhat hostile to the issue, they still learn a little bit more. And I really believe that information is the key here. I just think there are a lot of people that don't accurately understand it, and they conflate everything in the entire space with Bitcoin. You'll even see that in, you know, well-respected mainstream broadcast media sources with some super knowledgeable people. They just don't know the space well enough to differentiate some of that. And I think so, take time to do the meeting, and then when you do, make sure that you can talk about how it is different than the abuses. And I think one of the keys this piece is legislative certainty will help the market flourish in the United States if it's light touch. If it's heavy-handed, it'll just kill the market. People are like, yeah, well, I can go, as an entrepreneur in Boston told me, I'm feeling kind of Swiss. You know. It's like nothing personal. It's not that I don't trust you personally. I just don't trust this is going to get done. We're just feeling kind of Swiss. We're going to do that. And you know, you hate to hear that just because you know the market is so good here in the United States for so many things. And it's in our interest to do that. So I think the next thing there is to just be straight up. I think the good actors are pretty unified in saying, yeah, we're all for punishing the bad actors. The people that are lying, cheating, or stealing and taking advantage of people, we want the SEC freed up to do just that. Target these people, go after them, put people in jail for, you know, lying, cheating, and stealing in the industry. And then I think the last thing is when you're involved in spaces like, you know, whether it's not necessarily your member of Congress, but your fellow entrepreneurs, there are people that don't realize, well, if you do it that way, it actually is a security. You know, you can't just write a white paper and pretend that it's not a security and get away with it. There were some Wild West days where people made it to now. We probably have to deal with some safe harbor laws so now what? For those people that did act in good faith and didn't lie, cheat, or steal to take advantage of people. But just help people not make mistakes as you start to learn more about it yourself.
Why don't we open it up to one or two audience questions, and before we wrap it up, Paul?
Could you give us your background in the cryptocurrency?
Oh, here's the...
Into it? Oh, could you give us the background in cryptocurrency and the space and how you got into it?
Yeah, so thanks for that. And you know, one of the questions I had on CNBC was, how much of this do you own personally? And my answer was, unfortunately, none. I think it's a great space, but I'm in the process of regulating it. Although it would be legal for me to own things that are publicly traded, and we are not exempt from insider trading laws, despite the urban legends. I do believe this would be a phenomenal space. There are a number of trades I would love to make right now, but I feel as I'm in the process of regulating, that would probably be unethical. I've been curious about it as I dealt with Financial transactions involving my manufacturing companies. I've started looking at how do we move money, and we had a challenge in manufacturing as we started doing more and more business with China, that the US dollar for years wasn't convertible to RMB. So there was this period where we could have a bank account in Hong Kong and the Hong Kong dollar could be convertible to RMB and you could move through an intermediary there. And then you start looking at, well, how is this whole system of payment structured? And then the recession hits. And right after that, that was the inspiration for a lot of this with Bitcoin, with Ethereum, with some of the offshoots of that space. A lot of people looking at the institutions and the benefit of decentralized versus centralized. And you know, I kind of came at it as somebody just curious about the space as a manufacturing person. And then as I said earlier, as a member of Congress, I just look at financial services issues broadly and look at, there's a lot of my colleagues, in my opinion, who have solutions in search of a problem. And I was like, well, I don't want to be one of those people. I want to go find a real problem and try to help solve it. And I looked at this space as something that could use a good solution. I really view it as the early days of the internet in a way. It's going to be very different than the internet, but the applications are just as broad in the sense of, so what are you going to do with all this technology? How will you use blockchain? How will you use a distributed ledger to do payment systems? How will you do it to do identity or title or ownership? And you know, I couldn't even list them all off. It'd sound like the Bubba Gump piece. But you know, I think that's this piece in terms of how I came to get into it.
I had a question. Given there's bipartisan support for the token, sorry about that. Given the bipartisan support for the Token Taxonomy Act and also bipartisan support in privacy and what's happening with big internet, do you see any opportunities for identity or privacy solutions on blockchain that could be used as kind of use cases that would get people more educated?
Oh, thank you for that question. I'm begging for the Fourth Amendment to be relevant again. It has been under sustained assault in the United States. The Fourth Amendment historically guaranteed us a right to privacy with respect to financial transactions. You can't see it unless you look at it in the light the right way when you hold up your copy of the Constitution, you know, and you go, oh, yeah, it says right here, except for financial transactions. Oh, yeah, right. And if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. It's also in there embedded. And that's been the nature of financial transactions, which is part of the inspiration for this. Unfortunately, there's also a bipartisan consensus that the government needs to know more about you. And the other big threat right now to me with the lack of privacy and why I think private blockchain networks hold so much promise, and they are going to exist, whether they're in the black market or in the legal framework. So my hope is we get a good legal construct for them and actually make the Fourth Amendment part of America again. Is you see private companies deplatforming people. And part of the reason legal tenders printed on our money is because you need to know that I can pay for this and this money is acceptable. It's accepted anywhere in the United States of America. And because the US dollar is so well respected, I mean, if you can only have one thing in your pocket and you're traveling around the world, US dollars is pretty handy. So we're a long ways away from that for any crypto-based currency. But one of the things that to me that could kill the market is this energy behind private censorship. The idea that, well, I don't agree with what you're doing, and we can't make what you're doing illegal, but we're just not going to be able to transact your business. And it's interesting because for the longest time, some of the people that are the biggest instigators of deplatforming have been the biggest critics of the federal government doing this to people that are doing things like marijuana. So for a while, marijuana has been gaining in legal authority, legal recognition, whether it's recreational, medicinal, in states around the country. But the federal government has had banking laws that prevent banks from really effectively banking it. So some of the same people that are making the ideological argument that it's wrong for anyone to not bank these companies that are engaged in lawful businesses in Colorado or Ohio, for that case, which passed medical use case, are making arguments that, oh, it's right and proper that we deplatform people because I don't agree with their speech or I don't agree with their line of business. And I think that the intersection of that is identity and privacy. So I hope that we have the debate, but I think that the momentum is that private blockchains are a long ways out in the United States from gaining acceptance by the government. I can tell you FinCEN is not a fan, you know, in terms of where do we go, my hope is that we can do more things in the United States that certainly help us stop people that are lying, cheating, and stealing, committing fraud, funding illicit activity. But the exact opposite of illicit activity is it is legal, so then you should be able to transact in it.
I think we have one last question, and then we can all enjoy the reception.
Hi, thank you, Congressman. A two-part question. Number one, is the SEC or the CFTC, because they have connections to you also, are they pushing back? Are they, have they gotten wind of this, and what is their hope to push back on, because they see this as a real opportunity for some regulation? And the second thing is, if we had a foundational economic impact study, not what we've seen so far, the cheap analysis has been done, but if we could provide something to legislators to show the true economic impact of blockchain in America today, would that be something that's helpful to you?
I think real world information, just like the amount of capital that, frankly, Asia is throwing at this space versus the United States. So if you look at how well funded early stage companies are in Asia broadly compared to the United States, just the facts. And the reality is there are American entrepreneurs deciding that, look, Singapore and Hong Kong are a great place to do this business. If you look at where the resources are going to mine this, China clearly sees it as a beneficial thing to provide those resources to companies. Frankly, I'm concerned on a security perspective for some of the platforms because essentially China owns the ability to control the ledger in the long term because of the mining rates. So I do believe that you'll see nation states and non-state actors work to influence this space, just like you've seen with hard cash, And so some of my colleagues will conflate the things that could happen within this distributed ledger space with things that could already happen with cash. I mean, so I think the other thing is to the point on the SEC or the CFTC. Jay Clayton's been pretty vocal, but so is Bill Hinman. And the reality is the SEC, under the leadership of Clayton, has created offices. My concern is that the office that they created essentially says, well, whatever you're planning on doing, just come talk to us. And that is not an efficient way to launch a business. I mean, that's essentially why Central America has not attracted as much capital. If you work out the right deal with the right person and we customize it for you, but the next person in the door cuts a different deal and they get treated differently, that's not an efficient market. It's just not. And people don't have time for that, and no investor is looking at the risk of their investment just being poof like that because your interview with El Jefe didn't go well. So everyone starts feeling more like these other destinations are attractive in that framework. And my hope is that the folks at the SEC who agree with this line of reasoning can carry the day, because there are some. And the CFTC broadly is more receptive to it. And frankly, in terms of capital formation, I think you can make the case that Chicago and the commodities markets has actually outperformed New York right now. But you're seeing little small pockets happen all over because Ohio's a player in this space. I mean, we've got it, and we certainly like the red states to attract some capital. Not necessarily flyover country, not so much to politicize it. Flyover country.
Well, unfortunately, I think that's all the time we have today, but Congressman Davidson, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your leadership and that you took some time to speak with everyone here today.
Thank you very much.